I mean, we're not sure.
This is a connection.
It's definitely not a show.
But it's definitely not a show.
This is not a show and might not even be a connection. Here's Judah and guest.
Once again with my friend Joshua Blackburn, Captain Blackburn. I don't know if it's because I played baseball with my kids earlier or I'm just general anxiety, life anxiety, or COVID or what, but I'm feeling pretty mellow. Not necessarily in a good way yet. Do have a little locally brewed bourbon. It's the John A.P. Connolly. And one thing that we have talked about off and on. Well, last time we talked about eating. Last time we talked about eating and drinking, and we also brought in the topic of the sanctified food, the sacred food of the Eucharist, sacrament, the Eucharist. And one thing that brought to mind, a friend of mine, Gordon, a really good close friend of mine, was once told me that he read an important passage. I think it was by Calvin himself, talked about how important wine was to the Eucharist because of the elevated mood that it brought, and because Christ's blood elevates our mood. Christ elevates us, and the importance of the connection with that. I don't know. A lot of people have problems with Calvin, but I think that's an interesting point. And one thing we didn't really talk too much about, although we talked about the time I had white grape juice instead of wine for the Eucharist.
Was it white? Wasn't it like grapefruit juice?
Maybe it was apple juice. Maybe it was white. I don't know. I can't remember. It seemed like apple juice, but I think it was white grape juice.
I gotcha.
You ever had white grape juice where they peel it and then they make the grape juice out of it? It's like a white wine, but
I'm sure I probably had white grape juice at some time. I've had white wine.
There you go. Are you a fan of the fare of the wines?
So yes, I am.
Huh.
I spent a little bit of time in the restaurant and hospitality industry, and that allowed me to be introduced to a lot of very tasty wines. And then at that particular point in time, I was managing a bistro, and a couple of blocks away, there was a wine shop that, like, we would open up at, I'm trying to remember here, I think we opened up at 5. And they started doing, like, on Saturdays, they have a wine tasting like from 4 to 5. And the folks that I worked with, we would like rotate out so we could, quickly walk down the block, taste a couple of wines, and then go back to work.
Wow.
So no, I've
then go back to work. Wow.
Yeah. I've had the opportunity to drink lots of, taste, and lots of different wines. So yeah, I'm sadly, I've developed a champagne palate on a beer budget.
Literally a champagne palate, right? Like, you like champagne?
Oh yeah. If you can actually get a real champagne.
So, not a brute.
Well, so there are a handful of like commercial champagne. So while we're talking about beverages, but like kind of like a lot of European wines.
Okay.
There's what ends up in the store, and then there's what will end up occasionally in a good wine shop. So in the champagne world, I guess what you could say, I shouldn't say real champagne. I mean, real champagne comes from champagne.
Yeah.
However, what's kind of really desired are what are called growers champagnes,
Hmm.
and those tend to be produced on a vineyard by vineyard basis, and they're not typically something you see in box stores or the grocery stores. Um, they're not something you see every day. They're hard to find.
How much does a good bottle of champagne cost?
Yeah, you can get away with $30, $40, $50
Wow. And
on up, but
what's that?
yeah, and on up. But in the 30, 40, $50 range, you can snag a good champagne.
So is it basically just a bubbly wine? A
It is
bubbly white wine?
It is a bubbly white wine, but what makes a champagne is that it's grown in the Champagne region of France, um, and the
Why does that
varieties.
make a difference?
Well, just ask the French. They get so just so you know, like anything that's not grown in Champagne is technically sparkling wine.
Or bubbly
So,
wine?
well, or bubbly wine. So Champagne is a region in France, and
Yeah.
like a lot of wine growing regions, those
Yeah.
are almost like trademark names for
Oh yeah.
the type of wine that's produced there. But even within those regions, you get down to specific vineyards, and the mixtures of varieties of grapes that go into the production are different from vineyard to vineyard.
What is your theology surrounding drinking?
I don't have a theology. I probably do have an ethic or a doctrine around,
Oh,
the theologia.
what is your ethic surrounding imbibing of the alcohol? Obviously, you're
Well,
not against it. You're not against it.
no, I'm not. I think it's a gift. It's an opportunity for gratitude that's expressed in action. And like a lot of gifts, they can be overused. They can be underappreciated. They can be abused. So, yeah, I don't think I find in scripture or tradition any prohibition against the consumption of alcoholic beverages.
Yeah.
However,
so
there are warnings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the warning aspect has become so trite that it becomes hard to focus on. And there's a word here that I've been hearing from the Spirit or something. And let me know if this tracks with you. But it comes back to what I said about the elevated mood being important to the Eucharist.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about this once with somebody said they didn't want to drink wine at the Eucharist because they didn't want to stumble. And I thought that was backwards. That now some people, I think it is important, right? Is they have a certain allergy to the substance. However, I do think there is a directional blessing that comes from the Lord and through the sacraments that redeems those things that we partake of. And it's kind of like when my parents used to do things with me, when they used to drink wine with me, like it took the taboo out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
made it introduced it into a system that it would introduce it into a healthy system. And I think that correct me if I'm wrong, but if someone's consumption of alcohol is out of whack, it would be good to go back to the Eucharist.
It could. It certainly could.
You don't want to use that as like a magic thing, though.
Yeah, and I think, and I appreciate you mentioning like your parents, drinking wine with your parents and that removing the taboo. So I mean, personally, I kind of hold that ethic, um, and largely based on European countries. Like, it's not to say that there isn't alcoholism in Europe. It's just that, like, the notion of having a glass of wine is different than the American notion of drinking. Like, I'm going to have a glass of wine versus we're going to go drink.
Mhm.
When beverages get removed outside of the context of being food, and really the focus becomes on the fact that they are an inebriant,
Mhm.
then it's taken out of context and abused. Um, and I think, and I guess it's, I don't know, when someone, it, things need to be put in the right place.
Well, and I think that is an important part of that statement, that we use wine as part of the Eucharist, not solely, but in part because it elevates our mood. And you brought in the idea of thankfulness, an act of thankfulness. And we talked in church today, Sunday, about how thankfulness is the antidote to bitterness and selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like bitterness and selfishness is at the root of most over drinking, abuse of alcohol. And
It's pain. It's really good at reducing pain.
Yeah.
Maybe somewhat too much, and
kind of, but it at a certain point, and I guess that's the point I wanted to get to, is like the abuse of alcohol can take a man and woman, it can take a person into further deeper pain.
Oh, sure, absolutely. It will.
It does.
It will. And I often tell people, I really think this is true. There's only two kinds of drinking. That's when we drink to remember, or if we drink to forget. And maybe there's some other place in there, but generally, at least it's been my experience that tends to be, where things go. Like, we celebrate together, right? We people, drinking is often in a social context, and so we're creating memories.
Mm-hmm.
Or, gosh, when I get home, sometimes I like to sit on the front porch with a glass of whiskey and think through my day. But there's a kind of drinking, a consumption of alcohol that leads to forgetting.
Absolutely.
The point is to, literally to, it's an anesthetic. To escape.
To escape, or numb, or forget. Yeah. I'm certainly guilty of using alcohol as that agent, and it occurs to me, I don't know, there's a word here. There's a word here from the Lord about thankfulness. And I think too often, alcohol is expensive. And I feel like sometimes
it's a luxury, right? I mean,
it is a luxury. Yeah.
Even if you make it at home.
Now, you have made it at home before, right?
It's funny. I have professionally, like when I first moved up here to Northeast Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, the first year I lived here, I worked at a winery. And my wife has made beer. I've helped people make beer, but honestly, I've never, since you asked that question, it's like, well, not
have
really.
You ever?
I've never really gone off on my own. I was like, I'm going to make an alcoholic beverage. It's a craft.
A little bit.
It's a craft. I mean, it
is
to do it well. But
I've got a. Oh wait, we have a comment. I have a really close friend, a good friend back in Illinois, who said, Eric. Sometimes I don't know if he's tuned into this one, but he said once, he believes the best way to obtain moderation is to work for everything you get. So in other words, you can eat as much cake as you want as long as you make it. You can drink as much alcohol as you want as
Well,
long as you make it. I don't know about that.
That's a
But
nice concept, but I know a moonshine maker, and that rule doesn't work for him.
yeah, there's certain limits. Oh, Lynn's back with us. DIY thumbs up. Yeah. So Lynn, do you know of anybody? Do you guys make your own? I I've so the community that I used to be part of, there was a many of I remember. In fact, I didn't used to be much of a beer drinker at all. But the community I was part of, they would make their own beers, and we're pretty
Lots of
elitist
homebrewers.
about their beers.
Yeah.
And I just remember this one Michael Nowak made, and it still remains to this day my favorite beer of all time. I've never drank anything quite like it. It was a triple, tasted like banana.
Yep. Like a Belgian triple. Yeah. Did it have like little hints of clove in there too, or?
Yeah. It was mostly it was a softer banana. I like Belgians, and I like the flowery, the clovey Belgians, but this one was like a vanilla-y, banana-y Belgian triple.
Almost like a creamy banana Belgian.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And he had a tap downstairs, and man, I just remember
that's some serious home brewing.
Delightful.
If you're kegging it, that's
he does it up right, and he does every year does Oktoberfest.
Mm-hmm.
But to get to the ethic and where it coincides with our faith, I do believe there's something about if I find myself drinking too much, I'm not thankful enough. I wonder if I get to the point.
That's probably a good rule. I think or connection there.
I think it's something that I'm connecting right now, is that if I find myself medicating myself rather than celebrating with others, or then that extra drink means that I am not thankful. Now that could mean that I don't know, as a counselor, there's something in that, right? That there's a place of pain, of trauma, and thankfulness. Go.
Sure. Well, I mean, it just kind of hit me when I was thinking, like, there's this act of celebration, and I think of you think of weddings and toasts and that kind of atmosphere that's celebratory.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, we mentioned, and when I take that when it's one drink too much, and this is, I think, in my mind, when we move away from gratitude as an emotion or gratitude as a thought, but gratitude as an action, then it shifts from being an act of gratitude to an act of ingratitude, where we're no longer celebrating, but we're again anesthetizing, we're numbing, it becomes instead of communal and
Yes.
it's really self-centered, right? I mean, it's not something that we're involved with what's going on around us. It's very much wrapped in with ourselves.
It becomes a solipsistic problem in that we get stuck in these. We get stuck in a little bubble, a little black bubble.
It could be. I mean, that's the hard thing. Like, there's sometimes people around when you're in that bubble, but you're creating a bubble. You're creating a bubble, right? Like, you're getting to a place where you're not really going to be in communion with other people at that point. You're literally out of communion because you're out of sorts. You're not in your right mind. You're not in touch. And
it's escapism in the sense, it's escapism, and you're not, I'm not. So if I'm drinking too much, I'm not working on the problem, I'm running away from it.
Well, probably, though. I mean, that's the thing. I
Probably.
guess it's difficult. Is that like in a moment of remembering, in a moment of celebrating,
Mm.
it's not a problem focused event, right? I mean, it's not like I'm here to solve a problem. I'm here to enjoy. I'm here just to
That's a good
be,
point.
you know. And but if we're by ourselves, you know, like if we're in a solitary place,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, it becomes problematic.
Yeah, that's why drinking alone has always been a sign. I mean, there's many a country song that talks about
Sure,
dangers of drinking alone.
it's a good rule. Yeah, just don't.
Don't drink alone.
Um,
There is Lynn's back with another comment. There is something called a spike your juice kit, huh? That came with little packets of yeast. We're going to talk about yeast, and you just put it in half a gallon of clear juice, and I don't. And an event to make bugs out. Oh, event
Yeah,
to
like
keep
an
bugs
airlock.
out of the room
Yeah,
to brew. Easy.
you know, that's almost kind of sounds like
Homebrew.
a mail order hooch kit. You know, instead of like jailhouse hooch, it's spike
Well,
your juice. That's cool.
she says a Lidl, you know, so like Aldi's or something is.
Well, I
it's
was about to say, like we were talking about wine. Like I'm a big fan. I have a knack for finding the biggest bang for my buck on a bottle of wine. And Aldi right now is carrying the flag on big bang for your buck.
She says it is. I think to what you were saying, yeah. So I discovered, for better or worse, what somebody at the grocery store called, joking but stuck with me, the adult juice box.
Adult
box of wine.
Ooh, yes.
See, like I prefer
box wine.
Yeah, boxed wine. I grew up with my grandfather drinking boxed wine, and he would always have what is that? It's like a rosé.
Okay.
It's like a little rectangle.
Yeah,
and I always appreciated that.
Box wines are great for, you know, big bang for your buck. Yeah. And you can get decent box wine. I mean, there's some really decent box wines
nowadays. Well, see, I always look down on them, and I see that twinge of that. That's how you put your nose up like that.
I mean, but for medicinal purposes, box wine's great. No, I shouldn't say that.
No, well, yes, but it's also they can also be pretty tasty.
No, they really can. I don't like box wines because I can't see it. To me, it's like if I have it out, it's really easy to be like, and you lose. You lose track. You lose track.
That's what box wine. You can't tell how much you drank out of it. Yeah,
that's been my experience, and so I don't keep much of it around. Though I mean, drinking a little bit of red wine, like a glass or so a night, is, you know, it's just really good for you. And that's the last time I had box wines around the house, was when I was trying to keep like a more disciplined, like, well, I'm going to have a glass a night, you know, because I'm getting older and my people have heart issues, and I'm like, I'm going to do better. And yeah, that didn't work.
Well, so let's talk about the redemption of the yeast. I want to get back to the idea of yeast, because you were talking about the yeast in bread, and it's interesting that there's yeast in bread and there's yeast in wine. Yes. And I wondered if that was an important theological point.
Well, so I know we talked. Sure, I know we kind of went around that topic last week, and I poked around a little bit.
So you've done some poking around.
I did some poking around, and most of it's sort of like refreshing my memory, and this is, you know, and in poking around, you know, basically what I discovered, and I can put it in a nutshell. Um, you know, for about the first 1,000 years of church history, there is a decent amount of diversity. So, and of course, when I say that, I am going to kind of give my wink to my Greek friends and say that the predominant practice throughout the first 1,000 years of church history is the use of leavened bread. There are, in places, the use of unleavened bread, but it's the minority practice. It only really becomes a big theological controversy, around the time of the Great Schism. So like 1054, it becomes apparent between Constantinople and Rome that there are significant, liturgical differences. Now, the use of unleavened bread in Rome, at least like in the Roman Church, is actually older than that. However, when you go back to the real heart of the theological differences between the East and the West, the Filioque, there was a patriarch of Constantinople, so a bishop, who in the Eastern Church is considered a saint, Saint Photius, is the first bishop to raise the issue of, hey, y'all in Rome, this adding this part here to the creed, not only is that a violation of what we understand to be a consensual and communal understanding of the creed, but there's lots of theological problems.
Remind me what the filioque is.
Filioque. So the procession of the Spirit, of the Holy Spirit, by the Father and the Son in the Nicene Creed. So that's an interpolation. That's a later addition by the Western Church.
Adding the Son.
And the Son. Yeah, it's literally 2 words. Well, 3, if you can. It's really 2, but 3. And the Son. However, like Photius knew that about the Roman practice of unleavened bread and never raised it as an issue. It's only 200 years later that it becomes one of the extra things that gets thrown on in the division between East and West within Christendom. And so
where's the tie-in though with the filioque and the unleavened bread or the leavened bread?
The only tie-in is just the
schism.
It gets added to the list of things that substantiate the divide. However, and then the hard thing is this: like prior to the first 1,000 years, there was some liturgical diversity. Well, I shouldn't say some. There was a lot of liturgical diversity that in no way, shape, or form affected a clear understanding of the faith. Now, later on, there's some arguments about the symbolism. I tend to be more, when those types of issues come up, I tend to lean more towards, well, what was the historical practice? Well, historically, there was room for both. However, the majority were leavened bread users. And again, like I mentioned
but what about the tie-in? So sure, as a practical thing, it was much more practical to have leavened bread. So that may be the reason it was more predominant, more prevalent in the practice. However, what about the tie-in to the Passover?
Well, I mean, that's the Roman argument, is that there's this continuity with the Passover. The eastern side of the church, when it becomes an issue of polemics, like we're going to argue about why we're different. The foundational reason why leavened bread is used is just simply because the word artos is used in the New Testament, which is, generally speaking, more often than not, leavened bread. And so the argument goes is that what's actually being done in the what you see happening in the New Testament is a shift. Now there are counter arguments to that. That the disciples would have freaked out. There are some, like one or two examples of the use of the word artos in the Septuagint that clearly would have been unleavened bread. So what ultimately, like from a textual perspective, like if we're going to be like real wonky wonk, what does the Bible say and what does it mean? It's an unresolvable dilemma, in the sense that between like when you pull in the context of the Old Testament, you look at the specific use of the word in the New Testament, and if you take away any kind of appeal to church tradition and practice, post hoc, like what the church was doing in the first couple of centuries, and if you just focus solely on the text, it's it's like a Mexican standoff. It's like, well, it could be that. Well, it might not be that. So at least when I was reading around, it's kind of like, well, people of good faith have.
It sounds like a lot of it comes down to your tradition.
It does. Now, it for sure, and that's why predominantly the tradition has been leavened bread.
Now, how do you say that when predominantly the Catholic Church has been the majority of the church?
Well, it's not always been the majority of the church, and that actually hasn't always been the Roman. See, that's the other thing about Rome. It's funny. Like what goes on in Rome is often not always the way it's always been. And that's even true for the use of unleavened bread. Go figure. So it doesn't really come into the fore until like 7th, 8th century.
Interesting.
So yeah. Needless to say, there was a diversity of practices, and no one really had a big issue with it until about 1054.
Now, or more recently, I'm surprised there's not more issue. Well, I guess in the evangelical church, there hasn't been any issue, seems like, with using drink that has no yeast in it, right? So there's a problem with using bread that has no yeast in it, but I haven't heard anyone say anything. Well, of course, I'm sure the Catholics would be against it. Or what? No, they use grape juice too.
Well, Rome generally uses wine. I think there are some. I was reading today. There are some exceptions.
I don't know if I've ever been to a Catholic church where they hand out wine.
Well, no, they don't actually. No, they don't. They don't
they
serve
only
from the chalice. They don't serve from the chalice. However, like what's in the cup is generally wine.
Wine.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are some exceptions that can be made, but because it's still the fruit of the vine, so to speak.
Okay, explain this, because I have been to a Catholic church. I've been to many. Now, I do know that mostly they only give out the wafers.
Yeah, the host.
And then the priest drinks the wine?
And only the priest gets the wine. That is a Roman. That is we can add that to a long list of sticking points that Protestants and Eastern Orthodox can agree. We've got beef with Rome. That doesn't make a lick of sense. We just got a styrofoam wafer.
So, Lynn, I guess you're from the Catholic tradition at some point, huh? Yeah, I mean, I am, and they have some deep connection and pride that goes with my grandfather's faith, but also some reservations about the practices. There is something you said last time that stuck with me, and that is that the life that is in
that is an argument that the Greeks come up with, right? That the having leaven inside of the bread, is living, and without getting like way off the charts here, and because I don't think what I'm about to say is entirely valid. However, it was an argument that was made, and that's that Rome was Apollinarian, and that they denied the um, by only using unleavened bread, they were denying that Christ was truly a man. I think that's pushing it a bit much. Um, However, like the symbolism of yeast is in scripture is tricky. So sometimes yeast is used as a metaphor for sin,
Sin. Yeah.
right? But it's also used as a metaphor for the gospel. And so it's a mixed metaphor, but there's an aspect of like bread is a living thing. Wine, prior to pasteurization is a living thing. Um,
Hmm.
One could, I suppose, poetically, make the argument that that bread and wine as a sacrament um, is also a living thing, the very body and blood of Christ. So, but that's the problem, I think. Ultimately, though, with like the use of poetic language, is that if at some point it's a metaphor. It's going to break down. Um,
Mm.
But in daily use,
Yeah.
we should just eat our bread and drink our wine and be grateful.
Well, the gratefulness I think is super important. And as we're talking, I'm thinking about the redemption of the cup, the redemption of the bread, in the sense that when you were talking about it being a thankful thing that we do in community, and something you were just saying about about yeast, how it can be both sin and the gospel. And I feel like that's a good metaphor. It's a good application. Oh, I'm sorry. By the way, Lynn says she was raised in the Catholic Church for 18 years.
And then
Rebelled as she
rebelled.
became a young woman.
She
Yes,
rebelled.
she rebelled. So that metaphor, not even a metaphor, I think that's a very poignant example there of how wine can be both sin and the gospel.
Right? Yeah. And it's poetry. Yeah, it can go both ways, right?
Yeah.
It can be an opportunity for Thanksgiving, and it can also become an opportunity for repentance. Um, it's a gift, and gifts can be used well, or they can be used unwisely, or my favorite word, foolishly. Um, yeah.
Well, but I think deeper, just looking at myself, I think that the difference is looking at it as a gift, tapping into that thankfulness. What did you say again? It was is a physical act of thankfulness.
Well, yeah. We talk about emotions sometimes, and gratitude is one of these weird ones that, like, you can have an emotion, a feeling that corresponds to the notion of gratitude, right? Or I could have grateful thoughts, like I'm really grateful for my job, or I'm very, I give thanks for my children. Like sometimes, practicing gratitude, that's becoming a big and upcoming thing in the world, and I think it's important that we, I don't want to down that, because it's important. Like sometimes my kids do things that I don't like. However, the corrective to that oftentimes is for me to sit down and go, I'm really grateful for who they are, and to get really specific, because while sometimes they drive me crazy, they're actually really good kids. Um, and just saying that they're good kids isn't enough. Like being able to give thanks for, like, wow, you know, my Kim, with my second youngest daughter, she's really caring. Sometimes it it shows up in ways that just drives me batty. But she really is a caring kid. But that's like, there's an emotion, there's a thought, and we can articulate it in like a proposition. However, where does it move beyond those things into an action where it's like words, where it's poetry meets motion, like dancing and movement. Drinking with other people, celebrating with other people, feasting with other people, eating with other people, with our families. That is an action. That is an action that can be an action of gratitude.
Gratitude being an outward shared pleasure, an outward shared expression, or shared gladness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I like that.
I mean, it's just kind of like, worship the Lord in fear, or reverence. Well, I can say, well, I have reverence in my heart, but that's one thing, but it's another thing to bow down. It's another thing to prostrate oneself before the Lord, where there's a physical action.
What do you think? What do you think of this? If somebody has a problem with drinking too much, would a good thing to do be to limit? Maybe a good first step would be to limit their drinking to drinking with somebody that's drinking responsibly.
That's challenging. Because people's behaviors are very idiosyncratic. I mean, they're very particular to everyone. When you meet people that they might be binge drinkers, and sometimes they drink alone, sometimes they drink with people, sometimes and by binge drinking they might do it once every 2 months, they might do it once a month, they might do it once a week. There's some people that are what we call functional alcoholics. They just drink all the time. To me, I think the bigger question is, what is the function of the behavior? What purpose does the behavior serve? And then addressing the function and the purpose that's probably maladaptive, in the sense that it's not doing what you want it to do in reality. I mean, to some degree, it's you have to address the fact that it's working. It's serving a purpose.
Yeah.
Let's start there and start to break it down.
Well, maybe I can reframe it then. What if the best step would be to reach out to a friend? Maybe I think at the root of all selfish acts so the opposite of what was it called? The act of gratefulness. The opposite of the act of gratefulness would be the act of selfishness, I think.
Well, sure. Well, I mean, love of pleasure and pride. That's what gets us all. The love of pleasure and pride. It's what takes us all down.
Well, I don't even know the love of pride. To me, the love of pleasure it only becomes maladaptive as we use it, as we've talked about, to in pride, to mend our own ills.
When it becomes inordinate, right? Like when it gets too much. But the tied in with the love of pleasure is also an avoidance of pain.
Yeah. Huh.
Like, I don't want to deal with that.
Do you think, like, so sort of going between theology and psychology here, is it? I remember he was a good Christian counselor, talked about the importance of reaching out when struggling with sin, the importance of calling out and talking, bringing your sin into the light, rather than, and it gets into that solipsistic world of it's like the self-fulfilling, what do they call it, the vicious cycle,
There's all kinds of.
of self-pleasuring. It just leads to this cycle of regret, shame, and the need for more.
Oh, sure.
It does,
Because regret and
doesn't lead
shame
for,
causes pain,
Mhm.
right? And then I've got to do some more pain mitigation. But
That causes more pain.
yeah, that causes more pain. But bringing it out into the light is also an act of humility, which is an antidote to pride. I can
Yeah.
do this on my own. So I mean,
Well,
and sometimes the problem is
yeah.
those types of passions, they get wound together, and it's hard to really kind of peel them apart.
But I think a good action is to just I think is to go tell a friend.
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's definitely not going to create. Well, it could
I think it
it could
can.
be helpful.
It could be helpful. I
It could
think
be
I mean
helpful.
I think that's where the gospel, it's important when we talk about the difference between the sin and the gospel when it comes to the life of what are we talking, what was yeast, the yeast growing.
Mm-hmm.
I think the difference between sin and the gospel is the fellowship, right? So a solipsistic growth
Mm-hmm.
just becomes bigger and it becomes a tumor. Whereas a yeast within fellowship becomes shared,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like the lighter burden,
It,
the lighter yoke.
there's absolutely sharing the burden. I think the difficult thing about, again, let's go back to poetics and metaphors. So, I know a couple of things about yeast, and the difficult thing about yeast is there's different kinds of yeast.
Ah, I didn't know that.
So not all yeast is equal.
Right. Oh
So
yeah, because some yeast kills you, right?
well, I mean, you
It's
can
like
have,
deadly.
well, they could be, but some yeasts are good for certain things.
Okay.
Um,
Do tell.
like champagne yeast. The reason why, like, there are strains of yeast that are bred for champagne use because they can thrive in high alcohol environments. Um, you can have different strains of yeast that don't produce what you want. So, I mean, but no, I think there is an aspect of what you're saying in the sense that there is like this, reality that, and I don't know, this is again where it's going to break down. The life that we have together can be flourishing depending upon the kind of yeast. Because I mean, I know plenty of communities that, I'm just going to throw this one out here. Living in the part of the country where I live, like meth use, very few people use meth alone.
Huh.
I mean, some people do, but predominantly they're introduced to it by a friend, and it's within
Yeah.
a community of other meth users. So I mean, there's this is where that's what I'm saying, like the breakdown of the metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to stretch it too much.
Let's not stretch it, but let's hone in.
Yeah.
If we can cut down, I mean, we only have like a couple minutes left, but so a final thought here. Yeast. I think yeast, we started off, I think you mentioned you wanted to, continue
We'll talk
talking.
about yeast.
I like that idea because it's in so much we don't realize. And I do think that there are some really powerful implications for it in the sense that it spreads and it grows and it is life. And
It's living.
that's what I was left with.
It's living. It multiplies.
Living.
And it is symbiotic in the sense of like it's going to all depend on the kind of yeast, but also what it's feeding on in the environment that it finds itself in.
Yeah.
So, a good yeast, yeah, leavens the whole loaf. Whether for good or for ill, it leavens the whole loaf.
Wow. Do you know anything about Venom, the character?
I
Marvel
don't.
character?
This is the counterpart to Spider-Man?
Yeah,
No,
kind of.
he's sort of.
Yeah, sort
Yeah.
of. He was introduced by Spider-Man. It's just interesting you said that because he's a symbiote. He's
Oh yeah. I think I
from
did see. Yes.
he's
The,
from a different planet, and it's a symbiote. It's like an alien, and it basically amplifies. He amplifies whatever is in the person, but usually what is evil in the person. But uh, I don't want to go into. I don't want to nerd out on that, but I do. I like that though, in the sense that the yeast can often amplify what is already going. It does. It's a life, and it has a life of its own, and it amplifies what's going on, and it can amplify your gratefulness, or it can amplify your pain.
yeah.
I'll put that in the me statement. It can amplify I statement. It can amplify my gratefulness, my fellowship, or it can amplify my solipsistic pain. I think that's important and scary to look at.
Mm-hmm.
The bread can do the same thing, not
It,
just the drink, but the bread. I wonder the tie-in there. I guess I'm a little bit maybe it's excursus, but I am tied into this idea that I was brought up that the bread needs to be unleavened because of the Passover.
sure.
They were celebrating Passover.
Yeah.
And the theological significance of being ready. So making bread with yeast, you lose that aspect.
Well, it's certainly not as quick, right? So,
Well,
um,
not even close.
no. Well, I mean, I say quick. I mean, my wife can make, yeasted bread in several hours. So, um,
But you can make pancakes. You can make what are they called? Tortillas in like several minutes.
exactly. No, that's true. That's absolutely true. Um, yeah, I guess I've never really considered much about the readiness aspect, like
Well,
the watchfulness of it.
well, that is the point that's constantly brought up in my family is that that and I think that ties in. It may tie in as we have the yeast in the alcohol of the wine and no yeast in the bread, in the sense that there is the life in the wine, and that is representative of the blood where the life is, right? But in the bread is being ready, like physically, like the act of gratefulness, being ready, and sort of the positional aspect of taking the Eucharist. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
I don't know. That's kind of a stretch. Lynn says, I'm sorry. This is back when she was explaining. She started going to the Baptist church when Gina, not sure who Gina is, asked what God is at a couple of years old. Maybe her sister or something. Realized we were responsible
I'm
for
feeling
more
that's
than
probably your
ourselves.
daughter.
Or daughter, yeah. And got to church again, ASP. Oh, saved and baptized. At 30 years old. Okay, praise the Lord.
Yeah, children are good for that.
Yeah, they are.
Children are good for like.
Must be fed. Oh, the yeast. Oh, interesting. Yeah, they
it's
have to
true.
feed the yeast.
Yeah.
Huh. There is something about pain that we and about alcohol that feeds and we talked about the vicious cycle.
It can certainly turn into a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Like a lot of things in life, sadly, they're not linear. They're much more cyclical.
Circular.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that concludes our time, but thanks, man. Another interesting discussion.
Random thoughts with Judah and
Well,
Josh.
and see, like, I don't drink hard liquor, except I do appreciate to partake every now and then with you and with other friends. Usually with a cigar. I can't smoke a cigar here, but
Yeah, neither can I. So
but we should find a time to be able to smoke a cigar, partake in. You're the one who said it.
old world, new world.
And new world. Yes, I love it. I always bring that up every time. Whatever. So, oh, Scott, thank you for tuning in, Scott. Nice discussion. Well, thank you. Appreciate you for your participation, and I hope you guys. Thank you, Lynn, so much for tuning in again. Whoever I saw, there was various people tuning
Good to
in.
see you, Lynn.
Hope that we're able to at least pique your curiosity and maybe make a connection. May not be a connection.
May not be a connection.
Well, good night, everybody, and good night, Josh. We'll talk to you. We'll talk to everybody next week.